The year is 1914. Europe is on the brink of war, and a conflict unlike any the world has ever seen is about to unfold. In a matter of weeks, the world will be plunged into chaos, an event that will shape nations, change lives, and leave scars that last for generations. Welcome to Time and Us, where we dive deep into the past to uncover the stories that have defined our world. Today, we're stepping back into one of the most pivotal moments in history, the First World War. Known as the Great War, this conflict was a brutal and transformative struggle that reshaped the globe in ways that still echo today. From the first shots fired in Sarajevo to the final armistice signed in the forests of France, World War I was a war of unprecedented scale. But beyond the battles and the bloodshed, there were stories of heroism, sacrifice, and the indomitable will of the human spirit. In this video, we will explore the causes of the war, the unimaginable horrors faced by soldiers in the trenches, and the far-reaching consequences that changed the course of history. We'll uncover the untold stories of the men and women who lived through it and examine how this war set the stage for the century that followed. So, sit back and prepare to journey through time. Welcome to Time and Us, where history is more than just a lesson. It's the story of who we are and how we got here. Europe, in the early 20th century, was a continent on the edge of collapse. Beneath the surface of diplomatic niceties and treaties, there was a growing sense of unease. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, were locked in an intricate web of alliances, each one designed to balance the power of the others. But as history has shown, alliances are often fragile things, and the slightest spark could set off a chain of events that no one could control. In the years leading up to 1914, Europe had been experiencing rapid industrialization and militarization. Nations were not only building their empires, but also their military might. The arms race was in full swing, with countries like Germany and Britain competing to build the largest and most advanced navies. Meanwhile, the European powers were drawn into a series of colonial conflicts, particularly in Africa and Asia, where they sought to expand their empires and secure vital resources. But it wasn't just the competition for colonies that created tension. Nationalism, a powerful force in the early 20th century, was beginning to stir. In the Balkans, Slavic nationalism was on the rise, fueled by the desire for independence from Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Serbia, in particular, was at the heart of this movement, as it sought to unite the Slavic peoples of the region under its banner. Austria-Hungary, seeing this as a direct threat to its empire, was determined to crush any movement for Slavic independence. At the same time, the Russian Empire, which had long considered itself the protector of the Slavic peoples, was drawn into the conflict. The Russians saw the rise of Serbia as a chance to increase their influence in the Balkans and to challenge Austria-Hungary's dominance in the region. The stage was set for a confrontation, and when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo in June 1914, the fuse was lit. The assassination, carried out by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist, was the catalyst for the war. Austria-Hungary, furious at the attack on the heir to the throne, issued an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding that the Serbian government take responsibility for the assassination and suppress anti-Austrian sentiment. Serbia, backed by Russia, refused to comply with all of Austria-Hungary's demands, and on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. This was the beginning of the chain reaction that would lead to a world war. Russia, as Serbia's ally, began to mobilize its forces. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914. France, bound by treaty to Russia, was soon drawn into the conflict. When Germany invaded Belgium as part of its plan to attack France, Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914. The world, it seemed, had been plunged into war. But no one, not even the leaders of the warring nations, could have anticipated the scale of the conflict that would follow. What began as a regional dispute in the Balkans quickly escalated into a global war, involving not just the European powers but also nations from around the world. In the early days of the war, both sides believed that the conflict would be short-lived. The German military, in particular, had developed a detailed plan for a swift victory. The Schlieffen Plan, Named after its architect, General Alfred von Schlieffen called for a rapid invasion of France through Belgium, followed by a quick shift to the Eastern Front to deal with Russia. The Germans believed that by knocking France out of the war early, they could avoid a two-front conflict. But things did not go according to plan. The German invasion of Belgium was met with fierce resistance, and the British Expeditionary Force, sent to support Belgium and France, quickly engaged the Germans. The Battle of the Frontiers, fought in August and September of 1914, saw heavy fighting along the French-German border, but the Germans were unable to achieve the decisive victory they had hoped for. Meanwhile, in the east, the Russians had mobilized more slowly than the Germans had anticipated. The Russian army, despite being vast in numbers, was poorly equipped and poorly led. The Germans launched a series of offensives, and by the end of 1914, they had pushed the Russians back, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing them to retreat. Despite this, the Russians remained in the war, determined to fight on. The Western Front, however, was where the true horrors of the war began to take shape. By the fall of 1914, the conflict had settled into a bloody stalemate. The Germans had advanced deep into Belgium and northern France, but they were unable to break through the French defenses. The British and French, in turn, launched a series of counterattacks, but they too were unable to make significant gains. The result was a deadlock, with both sides digging in and preparing for a long, grueling war of attrition. The trench system, which would come to define the war, began to take shape in the fall of 1914. The soldiers, forced to live in these muddy, rat-infested trenches, faced constant shell fire, sniper attacks, and gas attacks. The conditions were horrendous, and the soldiers were often left with little respite. The front lines stretched for hundreds of miles, and the war became a brutal test of endurance. While the land war in Europe raged on, the conflict also extended to the seas. The British Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, sought to maintain control of the seas and prevent the Germans from breaking the British blockade of Germany. The Germans, in turn, sought to challenge British naval supremacy, using their fleet of U-boats, submarines, to disrupt British shipping and supply lines. The Battle of Jutland, fought in May and June of 1916, was the largest naval engagement of the war. The British and German fleets clashed in the North Sea, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The battle ended in a tactical stalemate, but strategically, it was a victory for the British. The Germans, despite their efforts, were unable to break the British blockade, and the Royal Navy maintained control of the seas for the remainder of the war. The U-boat campaign, however, continued to pose a significant threat. The Germans used their submarines to sink merchant ships, disrupting the flow of supplies to Britain and its allies. The British responded with the convoy system, in which groups of merchant ships were escorted by warships to protect them from U-boat attacks. Despite this, the U-boats continued to inflict heavy losses on Allied shipping, and the threat of starvation loomed over Britain. One of the most famous incidents of the U-boat campaign was the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger ship, in May 1915. The Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland, killing 1,198 people, including 128 Americans. The sinking of the Lusitania outraged the American public and brought the United States closer to entering the war. While the Western Front was locked in a bloody stalemate, the war on the Eastern Front was marked by more fluid movements, although it was no less brutal. The Russian army, despite its numerical superiority, struggled against the better-equipped German and Austrian forces. The Russians were hampered by poor leadership, outdated equipment, and a lack of proper training. The Germans, led by Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, launched a series of successful offensives, pushing the Russians back and inflicting devastating losses. The Battle of Tannenberg, fought in late August 1914, was one of the most significant battles on the Eastern Front. The Germans encircled and destroyed an entire Russian army, killing or capturing over 90,000 men. The victory at Tannenberg was a major blow to the Russian morale and set the tone for the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. Despite these early setbacks, the Russians continued to fight. In 1916, they launched a major offensive against the Austro-Hungarian forces in the Brusilov Offensive, which was one of the most successful Allied offensives of the war. The Russians inflicted heavy losses on the Austro-Hungarians and pushed them back, but the offensive was not enough to turn the tide of the war. By 1917, however, the situation in Russia had become untenable. The Russian economy was in ruins, and the morale of the soldiers was at an all-time low. The Russian Revolution of 1917, which saw the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II and the rise of the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin, led to Russia's withdrawal from the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, officially ended the war between Russia and the Central Powers, allowing Germany to shift its focus to the Western Front. As the war raged on, both the Allied and Central Powers realized that this was not going to be a quick victory. Instead, it was a long, drawn-out struggle of attrition. One of the most iconic battles of this type was the Battle of Verdun, which began in February 1916. Verdun was located on the French-German border, and it was a symbol of French pride and resilience. The Germans, under the command of General Erich von Falkenhayn, aimed to bleed France white, meaning they sought to inflict such massive casualties on the French that they would be forced to surrender. The French, under the command of General Philippe Pétain, were determined to hold Verdun at all costs. The battle quickly became one of the longest and most grueling of the war. The Germans launched a relentless bombardment, using massive artillery to pound the French defenses. The French soldiers, despite being outnumbered, held their ground, fighting day after day in the muddy, shattered landscape. The battle became a symbol of French determination, with the famous slogan, "They shall not pass," embodying the French resolve. The Battle of Verdun lasted for nearly 10 months, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. By the time the battle ended in December 1916, more than 700,000 soldiers had been killed, wounded, or missing. Verdun was a microcosm of the war itself. Endless suffering, relentless bombardments, and a staggering loss of life. The French ultimately held the city, but the cost was astronomical. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, the British and French were preparing for a major offensive of their own, the Battle of the Somme. Launched in July 1916, the Battle of the Somme was intended to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and to break the stalemate on the Western Front. The British, under the command of General Douglas Haig, hoped that a massive artillery bombardment would destroy the German defenses and allow for a breakthrough. However, the bombardment, which lasted for over a week, proved ineffective. The Germans had dug in deep, and their defenses were more resilient than anticipated. When the infantry assault began on July 1, 1916, the British soldiers were met with withering machine gun fire. The first day of the battle became the bloodiest day in British military history, with nearly 60,000 casualties, including over 19,000 killed. The Battle of the Somme would drag on for months, with little progress made. By the time the battle ended in November, more than 1 million men had been killed, wounded, or missing. The Somme, like Verdun, epitomized the horrors of trench warfare. The soldiers faced not only the constant threat of death from artillery, machine guns, and gas attacks, but also the physical and mental toll of life in the trenches. The ground was churned into a quagmire by the constant shelling, and the soldiers lived in conditions of unimaginable filth. The battle also marked the first major use of tanks on the battlefield, though their impact was limited at the time. While the war in Europe dominated the headlines, the conflict was truly global. The Allied powers sought to expand the war beyond Europe, hoping to weaken the Central Powers by opening new fronts in other parts of the world. The Middle East, Africa, and Asia all became theaters of war, where the global nature of the conflict was felt. In the Middle East, the British and French sought to weaken the Ottoman Empire, which had joined the Central Powers. The British, in particular, had interest in the region due to their control of Egypt and their desire to protect the Suez Canal, a vital link between Europe and Asia. The British also sought to curry favor with the Arab population, promising them independence in exchange for support against the Ottomans. The Arab Revolt, which began in 1916, was led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons, who hoped to establish an independent Arab state. The British, led by T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, provided military support, and the Arabs launched a series of attacks against Ottoman forces. The British also fought the Ottomans in Palestine, Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. The war in the Middle East was marked by guerrilla warfare, desert battles, and shifting alliances, but it ultimately resulted in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In Africa, the war took on a different character. The European powers, who had colonized much of Africa, used their colonies as pawns in the global struggle. German colonies in Africa, such as German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, became the site of bitter guerrilla warfare. The British and French forces, often supported by African soldiers, fought to capture German colonies, while German commanders, such as Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, waged a highly effective campaign of resistance. The war in Africa was also marked by atrocities, with both sides committing brutal acts against civilians and soldiers alike. The use of African soldiers in the war raised questions about colonialism and the exploitation of indigenous populations, and the war in Africa would have long-lasting consequences for the continent. In Asia, Japan, which had entered the war on the side of the Allies, quickly moved to seize German possessions in China and the Pacific. The Japanese took control of the German-controlled port of Tsingtao in modern-day China and several Pacific islands. Japan's role in the war marked the beginning of its rise as a major global power, and its actions in the post-war years would have significant ramifications for the future of Asia. While the soldiers bore the brunt of the fighting, the impact of the war was also felt deeply by civilians. The war was not just a military conflict. It was a total war that involved every aspect of society. The home front became just as important as the battlefield, and civilians were called upon to make enormous sacrifices. In Britain, France, and Germany, the war effort consumed the entire economy. Factories were converted to produce munitions, and workers were enlisted to support the military machine. The roles of women, who had traditionally been confined to the home, were transformed. With so many men away fighting, women took on jobs in factories, offices, and even on the front lines as nurses and ambulance drivers. The war marked the beginning of women's suffrage in many countries, as women's contributions to the war effort were recognized. But the war also brought suffering to civilians. Bombings of cities, particularly in France and Belgium, destroyed entire neighborhoods. The German bombing of London, known as the Zeppelin raids, was one of the first instances of aerial bombing targeting civilians. The war also caused severe food shortages, particularly in Britain, where the German blockade prevented supplies from reaching the island. Rationing became a way of life, and civilians were forced to make do with less. The most devastating impact on civilians, however, came from the Spanish flu pandemic, which spread rapidly across Europe in the final months of the war. The flu killed millions of people, far more than the war itself. It spread through military camps, hospitals, and civilian populations, exacerbating the suffering caused by the war. By 1918, the war had reached a breaking point. The Central Powers were exhausted, and their allies were beginning to crumble. The Ottoman Empire was on the verge of collapse, and Austria-Hungary was facing internal turmoil. The German army, despite its initial successes, was stretched thin, and the Allies were launching a series of successful offensives. The United States, which had entered the war in 1917, provided a much-needed boost to the Allied cause. American troops, led by General John J. Pershing, helped turn the tide of the war. The arrival of fresh American forces, along with the collapse of the Russian front, allowed the Allies to launch a series of offensives that pushed the Germans back. On November 11, 1918, the Germans, facing imminent defeat, sought an armistice. The war officially ended at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, marking the end of the conflict. The armistice was signed in a railway carriage in Compiègne, France, and the guns fell silent. But the end of the war was not the end of the suffering. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany. The country was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, and give up territory. The treaty redrew the map of Europe, dismantling empires and creating new nations. But the treaty also sowed the seeds of future conflict. The harsh terms imposed on Germany created resentment and economic instability, which would eventually lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II. The end of World War I did not bring peace in the traditional sense. While the fighting stopped, the consequences of the war reverberated across the globe, shaping the future of nations and individuals. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was a pivotal moment in history, but it was also a flawed peace agreement that sowed the seeds for future conflicts. For Germany, the treaty was a bitter pill to swallow. The country was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, a clause that many Germans felt was unjust. The war guilt clause became a symbol of national humiliation, and it was deeply resented by the German population. The reparations imposed on Germany were enormous, and the country was required to pay vast sums of money to the Allies. This financial burden, combined with the loss of territory and the dismantling of the German military, left the country economically and politically weakened. The discontent in Germany was not confined to the elite or the military. The ordinary citizens, many of whom had experienced the horrors of the war firsthand, were deeply affected by the terms of the treaty. The economic hardships, coupled with the social and political instability, created fertile ground for radical ideologies to take root. The Weimar Republic, which was established after the war, struggled to maintain control over a fractured and resentful society. The economic hardship, hyperinflation, and political extremism would eventually lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, setting the stage for World War II. But it wasn't just Germany that was affected by the war. The entire map of Europe was redrawn in the aftermath of World War I. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a major European power, was dismantled. New nations were created from its former territories, including Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary. The Ottoman Empire, which had sided with the Central Powers, was also dismantled, and the Middle East was carved up by the victorious Allies. The British and French took control of former Ottoman territories, establishing mandates in Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. The collapse of these empires led to the creation of new political entities, but it also left many ethnic and religious groups in conflict, as old borders and allegiances were disregarded. The Russian Empire, which had been overthrown during the war, was also deeply affected. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin, had resulted in the establishment of the Soviet Union, a communist state that would go on to shape the 20th century. The collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of communism had a profound impact on global politics, creating tensions between capitalist and communist powers that would last for decades. As we close this deep dive into the history of World War I, it's clear that the impact of this global conflict extends far beyond the battlefield. The war reshaped nations, altered the course of political ideologies, and left an indelible mark on the lives of those who lived through it. From the horrors of trench warfare to the devastating consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, the lessons of World War I are as relevant today as they were over a century ago. At Time and Us, we believe that understanding history is essential not only for appreciating the past, but also for shaping the future. The stories of the soldiers, civilians, and leaders who lived through the Great War remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, the costs of conflict, and the importance of striving for peace. As we continue to explore the events that have defined our world, we encourage you to reflect on how the echoes of history resonate in our lives today. History isn't just a collection of dates and facts. It's a living narrative that connects us all. By studying the past, we gain a deeper understanding of the forces that have shaped our societies, our cultures, and our identities. Whether we are looking at wars, revolutions, or the everyday lives of people from different eras, history gives us the tools to make sense of our world and navigate the challenges of the present. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. At Time and Us, we are dedicated to uncovering the untold stories, the hidden truths, and the forgotten chapters of history. We hope that this exploration of World War I has inspired you to continue learning, questioning, and reflecting on the past. If you found this video insightful, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with others who are passionate about history. Together, we can keep the conversation going and ensure that the lessons of the past are never forgotten. Until next time, remember that history is not just about the past. It's about us, here, today, and how we choose to learn from the world that came before us.